Back to domestic politics now, and I'm joined live out of our Brisbane studio by the member for Petrie, Liberal MP, Luke Howarth. Thanks very much for your company.
Great to be on the program, Peter. Thanks for having me.
I want to talk to you about penalty rates and housing affordability as a story emerging today, as well as from the conversation Paul Kelly and I had yesterday here on Sky News with the Treasurer, Scott Morrison. But just a quick one before we get to that, if I can. Some government MPs, including from your state of Queensland, people like George Christensen, for example, are pushing for changes to 18C. They say that it's necessary. I'm not actually sure what your view is on this, but they say we've got to do it. Now, the government took a policy to the last election not to change 18C, yet similar MPs are arguing that there's no way that the government can change its stance to allow a free vote on same-sex marriage. Why? Because it took a plebiscite to the election and it can't break that pledge. Surely you have to either break both pledges and look at 18C and look at a free vote on same-sex marriage, or be consistent and break neither. But it feels like a lot of government MPs want one but then don't want the other.
Well, it's a good point that you raised, Peter. I mean, in 2013 we took a policy to the election that we would change 18C. And then, of course, as you say, at the last election we didn't. But when you talk to what really matters to people on the ground, and I think what Barnaby Joyce said a few weeks ago, people don't walk up to me in the street sort of saying, look, let's change 18C. It's certainly not an issue they raised with me this morning when I was out doing mobile offices or anything like that. But if you do say to people, do we need free speech in the country, of course they will say yes. And I think partly what we're seeing with you know, some of the rise of crossbenchers and things are people concerned about free speech and people concerned that we're moving away from the Australia they knew, particularly older Australians. So my view on the issue is, look, I believe in free speech, but I think that the Prime Minister has a difficult job in listening to government MPs right around Australia, not just in Queensland, but in Western Sydney and Victoria, over in the West in WA, and we need to do a policy that everyone agrees with, that's in the best interest of people.
So does that leave you wanting to kind of leave them both alone despite your predilection towards free speech? Something that I have sympathy for, by the way, but they're election commitments, so you don't want to get into the weeds on either of these? Or are you happy to try to run the line that one was an election commitment and whilst the other one was too, who cares, let's look at changing it?
Well, I still, in the back of my mind, I also remember in 2013 we said we would change it, but as I say, I'm not hard line one way or the other. I believe in free speech. I think it's good for Australians to be able to speak freely in what they believe. I sympathise with what happened to those QUT students in Queensland, and no one wants to be dragged through courts. But the way forward is to be inclusive with government members and say, how do we get a good compromise here that's in the best interests of Australians? That's what really matters here, what's in the best interests of Australians. And we see Bill Shorten on that issue again, trying to say, well, what bigotry speech would you like people to be able to say? He's not interested in what's best for Australians. He's interested in what's best for Bill Shorten, and what he'll use anything to get himself into the lodge. And that's part of the problem with Australian politics today. People like the Leader of the Opposition that don't look at what's best for Australians, only look at what's best for him.
What did you make of Pauline Hanson saying she admires Putin?
What was that, sorry?
What did you make of Pauline Hanson saying that she admires Vladimir Putin?
Oh, well, look, I did hear that comment, and I think the Prime Minister was right to point out, you know, MH17 and what happened with that plane being shot down. And look, I mean, there's no doubt Putin's a strong leader, you know, and he's pro-Russian, he's a Russian president, but, you know, we've got to look at what he's doing in balance, and so I think that comment probably wasn't looked at in balance. All
right, let's move on to the big issues of the day, and indeed likely to be big issues going forward. We might start with penalty rates if we can, Mr Howarth. I wrote about this on the weekend. It's not that I don't have an ideological sympathy with the economic merits behind changes to penalty rates, but practically speaking, implementing it where there's no disadvantage test for people that are just often low-income workers losing a Sunday penalty rate, coupled with the scare campaign that will be mounted a la work choices, or dare I say Mediscare, but this time with some validity attached to it, unlike the Mediscare campaign, coupled with what seems to be a bit of a mealy-mouthed response from the government, I have to say, where they're sort of wanting to half stand by the decision from the Fair Work Commission, half pretend that because it's independent they therefore don't have to offer an opinion. I see you guys getting eviscerated on this one politically. Tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I read your article and I thought it was right, particularly when you said that Bill Shorten was hypocritical on the issue, because he absolutely is. And I think what you've seen from government MPs is trying to think before we speak, look at what actually the Fair Work Commission has done, get our heads around it, get out into our electorates like I did yesterday and speak to pharmacists that were open and look at the ones that were shut. But what you see with Bill Shorten is him rushing out on the day this is announced, bringing out some guy named Trent that said he was going to be affected by it, and then we find out that he's not because he's on an EBA, and at the same time find out that he's a Labor Party man that hands out for the member for Lindsay at the last election. And this is the problem with people like Shorten. I mean, I sit in the Parliament last week thinking, are we really representing the best interests of Australians here when we see Bill Shorten come out so strongly on an issue without the facts, putting his foot in it like he did with that guy Trent? And we see the hypocrisy, what he did with enterprise bargaining agreements, reducing workers' penalty rates, making sure that unions get a kickback from those same companies, and now he wants to make out as though he's the workers' best friend. So what I've been doing is getting out, looking at how this will benefit people in my electorate. And I do note that in the hospitality sector that it doesn't affect casuals, which I would have thought would have seen the most growth there, with cafes closed on Sundays, but it only affects part-time and full-time wages there.
Just a question on that. Wouldn't a business, I mean, this is just to play devil's advocate to that, but isn't there a risk for Conservatives who presumably by extension like family time and therefore weekend time with family, isn't there a risk that if you're going to be able to pay part-time permanent workers or full-time permanent workers less to work on a Sunday, there is going to be less casuals working on a Sunday by definition, because businesses are going to decide they want to pay part-time and full-time workers less to work Sundays, which means that these people in part-time or full-time work are going to be getting potentially dragged away from family time, whereas casuals, which might be students or younger individuals, for example, where that's less of an issue, isn't that a concern you might have with the Fair Work judgment on that?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it is. And when I saw that, when I saw the Fair Work Commission's judgment, I thought the same thing. I would have thought that it would most benefit casuals that want to work Sundays and can do the extra hours. The only thing I could think of, and I was speaking to the member for Reid about it the other day, is that maybe they're trying, with their decision, trying to get employers to push more people into permanent part-time and full-time, which may bring the added benefit of more job security for some workers, you know, because obviously if you're looking for a home loan, if you're talking about housing affordability, if you're looking for a home loan, it's very hard to get a home loan if you're on casual wages, whereas if you're in a permanent part-time position or full-time, then you can get it. And so people in the hospitality sector may weigh up and say, well, look, we normally use casuals, but this decision may make it more beneficial for us to put on more permanent part-time workers. And so that could be a benefit to workers. As
a government holding a key marginal seat before the last election, not now, to your credit, it's no longer the most marginal seat that the government holds, yet you still hold it despite a number of seats going the other way at the last election. Are you a little frustrated that the government didn't plan for this a bit better? I'm talking about the executive side of government here, your ministerial colleagues. Are you disappointed that they didn't have a strategy ready to go for when the Fair Work Commission judgment came down? Indeed, have done any of their own research into the economic impacts of it, rather than just relying on the Productivity Commission or indeed the Fair Work Commission? It was the head of Treasury that told an estimates committee that he doesn't even have an opinion on what impact this judgment might have on employment.
Well, look, I think government ministers are busy with a whole lot of issues that they're dealing with, but you're right. I think they were probably surprised. I mean, the Fair Work Commission, after all, was set up by the Labor Party. 3 of the 5 people that made this decision were appointed by Bill Shorten himself, and I think they might have been surprised with the decision that they brought down, because they might not thought that it went that way. But ultimately, look, I think what's important now is what the Prime Minister's done, is that we think before we speak, that we don't rush out of the gates like Shorten does, mouthing off, scaring the whole community. I mean, is this what we're really here as politicians to do, to scare the hell out of Australians on every single issue, whether it's Medicare, whether it's penalty rates, whether it's reductions in company tax or our Australia's free trade agreements, what he did with unions? I mean, that's their whole strategy, to scare the hell out of every Australian. And I think that's why Australian people are looking at politicians going, gee, you know, is this what we really want from them? You know, 7 months after a federal election, we need to be thinking what's best for the Australian people and having a bit of bipartisan support on many issues. And when I sit in the parliament, I don't see that from the opposition leader at all. And I think our country would be a lot better for it if we did see that.
Just finally, if I can, before I let you go, the issue of housing affordability, there's a whole discussion about that Scott Morrison has kicked off, as I mentioned off the top of our interview. Can I ask you about negative gearing, though? Like, I get that the government doesn't agree with Labor's model. I get that you're concerned about what removing negative gearing might do. But here's what I'm really interested in. Why not just curb the absolute excesses of negative gearing? You don't embrace the Labor model. You don't jeopardise what it might do to the housing market, but you get rid of the ability of people to have literally dozens of properties that they're reducing their taxable income on. I would have thought that that's smart policy without playing in to Labor's approach, which frankly you'd be able to continue to point out has its downsides.
Yeah, look, you raise a good point, and we went to the last election saying that we wouldn't change negative gearing, so I'd be careful.
You went to the
in what
last
we do
election,
there.
though, Luke Howarth, in fairness, saying you wouldn't change 18C, where we started this interview.
Well, yeah, I see your point there, but in 2013 we did. It wasn't a major issue of the election, but I got to say, at the 2016 election, I didn't campaign on 18C. It wasn't raised at all. Whereas negative gearing was raised on a daily basis when I was out in the field. And for an area that I represent, I have a lot of people renting, I have a lot of people that are probably below average wages, and I was concerned that if we got rid of negative gearing, that investors would have to positively gear, which would see rents increase. And that's a real concern for people in my electorate as well. But I do say that 90% of people that negatively gear only have one property, and that may be something that the Treasurer does look at in the future, or just restricting it onto new houses or one. But right now I don't think it's something that we should be changing, given it was a prominent part of the 2016 election that we did fight on and said we wouldn't change. We've got to be very careful about doing that, taking a position before the election and then changing it. We've seen Prime Ministers and governments come unstuck before on that issue, and yeah, I think we need to stick to what we said we'd do. And that's why it's frustrating when all the things we said we'd do, have a plebiscite on marriage equality, reduce company tax, whatever it is, and it's very difficult to get that through. In saying that, we have got things through like, you know, setting up the Australian Building and Construction Commission and making union bosses accountable like company directors, tackling multinationals, which we've done with the diverted profits tax last week, and of course getting rid of the gold travel card, which is now gone, buried, which the Turnbull government done just a couple of weeks ago. So we are getting things through, but there's more to do, and I'd love to see more support from the crossbenchers this year. You'll
have to have a quiet chat to your LNP colleague Ian McDonald about the value of that gold card reform, but we're out of time. Luke Howarth, appreciate your company as always. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.